I wasn't supposed to be there that night. That's the first thing I need you to understand. I was supposed to be in my tiny apartment, wearing sweatpants, eating leftover Chinese takeout, pretending the world outside didn't exist. But fate, if that's even what it was, has a cruel way of dragging you into places you were never meant to go, making you cross paths with devils who smile like men. The club was pulsing long before we even stepped inside. The bass throbbed through the concrete walls like a living thing, the kind of rhythm that crawls beneath your skin and dares you to surrender. My best friend, Lena, was the one who convinced me to come. "You need to live a little," she'd said, tugging on my arm as if I was a child refusing to join the playground. "This place is exclusive, Ava. The Valentis own it. It's dangerous, rich, and impossible to get into. Basically everything your boring life is missing." And I'd laughed, because I was the boring one, the quiet one, the girl who blended into every crowd. I was the type of person who disappeared behind louder voices, who smiled politely, and then faded from memory the second I walked away. I wasn't built for danger. I wasn't built for the kind of darkness that existed behind velvet ropes and whispered names. But maybe deep down, some part of me was curious. Maybe that was the mistake that changed everything. The line outside was endless, full of sharp perfumes, glittering dresses, and men who looked like they'd bought their souls from the devil himself. Yet the moment we approached the entrance, the guard's expression changed. One glance at Lena, a quick flick of his eyes toward me, and suddenly the velvet rope parted like it was waiting for us. I remember the way his gaze lingered, assessing, maybe even pitying. I should have paid attention to that look. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and sin. Music wrapped around us, heavy and seductive, drowning every thought. Lights flashed in deep crimson and gold, painting everyone in shades of temptation. The crowd moved like one body, a blur of sweat, laughter, and lust. Somewhere between the strobe lights and the scent of burning whiskey, I forgot to breathe. Lena disappeared first, pulled into the crowd by a man with tattoos snaking up his neck. I didn't follow. I stood by the bar, my pulse stuttering, my nerves unraveling, pretending I belonged. The bartender looked like he'd seen everything, every deal, every seduction, every fall. He handed me a glass of something that smelled expensive and wrong. I sipped it anyway, because pretending felt easier than running. That's when I felt it, the weight of a stare. It wasn't casual or curious or flirtatious. It was possessive, heavy, like being caught in a net I hadn't seen coming. I turned, slowly, and saw him. He sat in the far corner, away from the chaos, as if the world moved around him and not the other way around. His suit was black, tailored, within an inch of sin, his shirt undone just enough to show the sharp line of his throat. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. His presence was the kind of thing that demanded silence without a single word. Every person near him seemed smaller, quieter, like they knew better than to exist too loudly in his orbit. Our eyes met, and the room stopped moving. The music blurred into static, the lights dimmed, and for a heartbeat too long, it was just him and me. His gaze swept over me, slow, deliberate, predatory, and I felt stripped bare, like every secret I'd ever tried to hide was suddenly visible beneath that gaze. I looked away first. Of course I did. I wasn't brave enough to hold the eyes of a man like that. But when I blinked, he was already standing, cutting through the crowd with lethal grace. People moved aside instinctively, like the sea parting for something divine or dangerous. I told myself he was heading somewhere else, maybe to someone waiting for him, maybe to business that had nothing to do with me. But then he stopped right in front of me, his shadow falling across my hands where they gripped the glass too tightly. "Dance with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an invitation. It was an order spoken like silk and sin. His voice was deep, The kind that slides down your spine and makes your knees forget what they're supposed to do. I don't dance, I stammered, already shaking my head, already trying to retreat into the comfort of invisibility. But his hand reached out, curling around my wrist. His touch was cold, electric, and terrifyingly gentle. You do now. And then I was pulled into him, into the center of the dance floor that had seemed so impossibly crowded until it wasn't. Somehow the people melted away, leaving only the heat of his body pressed against mine, the scent of dark cologne and danger filling my lungs. I don't even know your name, I whispered, because it was the only thing that made sense to say. His lips curved, but his eyes didn't soften. You don't need to. My heart thundered. I should have pulled away. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that no man should look at me like I was a possession waiting to be claimed. But there was something about him. Something magnetic and violent and impossible to resist. The song shifted, slower now, darker, and he leaned closer until his breath touched my ear. You're mine tonight. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They slid into me like a promise wrapped in a threat, the kind that burns long after it's spoken. I froze. Every thought vanished. I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was insane, to say no and mean it. But my voice betrayed me. My body betrayed me. Because even as fear coiled in my stomach, there was something else. Something wickedly alive that wanted to know what being his would feel like. When I finally looked up, his expression was unreadable, but his hand lingered at the small of my back, firm and possessive. He didn't ask again. He didn't have to. I already knew that nothing about this night would end where it started. The world around us resumed its rhythm, the crowd dancing, the lights flashing. But I felt separate, like I'd slipped through some invisible door into another reality entirely. By the time I found the courage to step away, he was gone. Just gone. As if the earth had swallowed him whole. I searched for Lena, but she was nowhere. My drink sat abandoned on the bar, the glass smudged with fingerprints that weren't mine. The night outside had turned cold and silent, and as I stumbled onto the empty street, a single black car waited by the curb, its engine humming softly. The window rolled down, and I saw him again. Those eyes, that calm, predatory stillness. Get in, he said. I wanted to say no. God, I wanted to. But something inside me already knew that I had stopped belonging to myself the moment he whispered those words. And as I stepped toward the car, heart hammering in my chest, I didn't realize that it wasn't just a ride I was accepting. It was the beginning of something that would destroy everything I thought I knew about love, danger, and the man the world called a monster. Because by dawn, I would understand the truth. I hadn't met a man that night. I'd met my fate. The car ride was too quiet. The kind of silence that isn't really silence at all, but something heavier, thicker. The kind that presses against your lungs and dares you to breathe wrong. The kind that hums with unspoken rules and invisible lines you can't see but already know not to cross. I sat in the back seat, the leather cool beneath my legs, my fingers clutching the edge of my dress as if fabric could anchor me to reason. The driver didn't look at me, didn't speak, didn't even flinch when we passed through red lights, as if they were nothing more than optional details in a world that didn't apply to the man sitting beside me. He hadn't said another word since I got into the car. He didn't need to. His presence filled every corner of the space, an unspoken command wrapped in silence. He sat with one arm draped lazily across the back of the seat, his fingers brushing against the edge of my shoulder, in a way that didn't feel accidental, yet it wasn't exactly intimate either. It was a quiet assertion of control, a reminder that I was here because he wanted me here. Outside, the city flickered by in blurred streaks of neon and shadow. I tried to memorize every street sign, every turn, but it all bled together. as if the world beyond the car's tinted glass no longer existed. I remember thinking how strange it was that fear could feel so much like fascination, how the line between danger and desire could twist so easily until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. When the car finally stopped, it wasn't at some grimy warehouse or candlelit club, like I'd expected. It was a penthouse tower, all glass and steel and quiet menace, the kind of place that whispered power through every polished surface. The elevator ride felt endless. I could feel the heat of him beside me, the faint scent of smoke and cedar lingering in the air between us. And when the doors slid open, I stepped into a world I didn't belong to. The penthouse was immaculate, modern, cold, stunning. The windows stretched floor to ceiling, framing the city below like a conquered kingdom. Everything gleamed, the marble floors, the crystal decanter half filled with amber liquid, the dark leather furniture arranged with precision that spoke of control rather than comfort. I could almost feel his personality in the space, uncompromising, exacting, dangerous. "Sit," he said finally, his voice quiet but absolute, like the word itself had been carved into the air. I sat. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the amber light catching on the sharp lines of his jaw as he turned toward me. "You have questions," he said simply, handing me the glass, his eyes locked on mine as if he already knew what they were. Who are you?" I managed, though the words came out too soft, too uncertain. A slow, humorless smile curved his lips. "You already know." And I did, though I didn't want to admit it. His name had been whispered like a rumor in every dark corner of this city. Dante Valenti, the Valenti heir, the man who made people disappear with a phone call, the devil in a tailored suit. He didn't rule through fear alone. He ruled through precision, through calm, through that terrifying kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself because it simply is. I swallowed hard. "Why me?" He studied me, his gaze so steady it almost hurt to meet it. "Because you were there," he said after a long moment. And though the words were simple, there was something in the way he said them, something that suggested there was more beneath the surface, something I couldn't yet see. "I don't understand." "You saw something you shouldn't have." He took a slow sip of his drink, unbothered, as if this were a conversation about the weather. "And now that makes you a liability." My stomach dropped. "A liability?" He nodded once. "Relax," he said, though his tone carried no comfort, only command. "You're safe, for now. But until I decide otherwise, you don't leave my sight." There it was, the cage closing around me, invisible but unyielding. I should have screamed. I should have demanded to leave, to run, to call someone. But instead I sat there, caught between fear and the strange pull of the man who seemed carved from stone and fire all at once. "You can't just keep me here," I whispered, though even as I said it, it sounded weak, childish, naive. He set his glass down, leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes sharp as blades. "Can't I?" Something inside me trembled, not just from fear, but from the dangerous truth behind those words. He could. And worse, part of me already knew he would. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time didn't feel real in that place. He showed me a guest room, told me to rest. The room was beautiful, but sterile, untouched, as if no one had ever truly lived there. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the city lights flicker like dying stars, wondering what kind of story I had just stepped into, and whether I was meant to survive it. When I finally turned, he was standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, silent and watching. His eyes caught the dim reflection of the skyline, and in that faint glow he looked almost human. Tired, maybe, or haunted. But the moment I blinked, it was gone. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we'll talk." I wanted to ask about what, but something in his tone warned me not to, so I just nodded, and he left, the soft click of the door echoing louder than any threat could. That night I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice, felt the weight of that whisper again. You're mine tonight. But what scared me most wasn't the memory of his words. It was the part of me that couldn't stop replaying them, that couldn't stop wondering what it would feel like if he said them again. Morning came in slow shades of gray, the kind of light that doesn't warm, only reveals. I found a tray waiting outside my door, coffee, fruit, a note in neat, slanted handwriting. Eat. We have much to discuss. I almost laughed, because who leaves breakfast for their captive? But I ate anyway, because hunger and fear live close together, and I didn't know which one would win if I ignored either. When I finally stepped out of the room, I found him sitting by the window, the skyline burning gold behind him. He looked every bit the part of a king surveying his city, the kind of man who didn't ask for loyalty because he owned it. You slept, he said, though it wasn't a question. I tried. He turned to face me, and for a long moment he just looked. I could feel it again. That pull, that invisible current that made everything else fade away. Then with a quiet sigh, he said something that made the air shift between us. You need to understand something, Ava. The moment you stepped into my world, you stopped being invisible. And once that happens, there's no going back. I didn't realize I was trembling until he stood, until he crossed the space between us in 2 measured strides and reached out, tilting my chin up until our eyes met. You think I'm the danger, he murmured, voice low enough to send shivers crawling down my spine. But the real danger is that you'll start to like it. And in that moment, with his breath against my skin and his truth cutting deeper than any threat, I knew he was right. Because I already did. The first thing I noticed the next morning wasn't the sunlight streaming through the tall windows or the quiet hum of the city far below. It was the silence, the kind that doesn't soothe but unsettles. A silence so deliberate it feels like it's listening, like the walls themselves are waiting to see what you'll do next. I sat on the edge of the bed for what felt like hours, my bare feet pressed against cold marble, my thoughts tangled between disbelief and the haunting truth that I was still here, still in his world, still caught in something that made no sense and yet felt too real to escape. When I finally opened the door, I found the penthouse transformed from the eerie calm of night to something sharper, busier, alive with motion and authority. Men in dark suits moved through the space with the precision of soldiers, their voices low, clipped, reverent. Every one of them carried the same air, alert, dangerous, respectful to the point of fear. I realized quickly that they weren't just bodyguards, they were loyalists, soldiers in Dante's private army, wolves, and I was the stray who'd stumbled into their den. The moment they noticed me, the air shifted. Their gazes flicked toward me like blades catching light, some curious, others cold, 1 or 2 openly suspicious. I didn't know where to go, but before I could even ask, a man stepped forward. He was tall, built like a shadow-given form, with dark eyes that didn't soften when they landed on me. "Miss Moretti?" he said, his voice smooth but distant, like polished stone. "Mr. Valenti is waiting for you in his office." I wanted to ask how he knew my name, but the words stuck in my throat. Of course they knew. Of course he knew. Men like Dante didn't let anyone inside their walls without knowing everything about them. He led me through a corridor lined with glass and quiet menace until we reached double doors that opened into what could only be described as a kingdom disguised as an office. The room was vast, the kind of space meant to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, sunlight reflecting off the sleek black desk where Dante sat, head bent slightly as he read through a file. When he finally looked up, it was like the air changed again, charged with something I couldn't name. "You're awake," he said simply, as if it was a fact he'd been waiting to confirm. I nodded, uncertain what to say. His gaze flicked briefly to the man who'd escorted me, a silent dismissal. And just like that, we were alone again. "Do you know who my family is?" he asked, not accusingly, but with the quiet weight of inevitability. "I've heard things," I admitted, my voice small, swallowed by the expanse of the room. He leaned back in his chair, studying me the way a predator studies the line between curiosity and fear. "And what have you heard?" "That you're dangerous," I said, hesitating, because saying it aloud felt like touching fire. A faint smile ghosted across his lips, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Dangerous," he repeated softly, almost amused. "That's what they call power when they can't control it." He stood then, moving around the desk with unhurried grace, his steps soundless against the marble. When he stopped in front of me, I could feel the weight of his presence the way you feel heat before you touch a flame. "You saw something last night," he said. "Something you shouldn't have." I frowned, shaking my head. "I didn't see anything. I just—" "Yes, you did." His voice was low but unyielding. "You saw me meet with a man named Russo. You saw me take his hand. You saw what happened after." The memory flashed behind my eyes, the brief glimpse across the club. Two men shaking hands, the momentary tension in the air, the way Russo had vanished into the back room and never returned. I hadn't realized what it meant then, but I did now. My breath hitched. "You killed him." Dante didn't flinch. He made a choice, and choices have consequences in my world. I took a step back, but he followed, closing the distance until I was pressed against the edge of his desk, the city sprawling behind him like a silent witness. "So what happens to me?" I whispered, my voice trembling even though I tried to steady it. "That depends on you." His gaze softened just enough to unsettle me further. "I could have had you silenced last night. I didn't. Instead, I brought you here." "Why?" "Because something about you—" He paused, eyes tracing my face as if searching for an answer he hadn't yet found. "Something about you made me hesitate. And that doesn't happen to me, Ava." Hearing my name in his mouth felt like a sin, like something sacred that had no right to sound so intimate. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. He had this gravity, this impossible pull that drew you in even when every instinct screamed to run. He stepped closer, his hand lifting, not touching but hovering near my jaw, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "You don't belong in this world," he said, almost gently. "But now that you're here, you can't just walk away. The people I deal with, they'll see you as leverage, and leverage gets people killed." I swallowed hard, the reality of his words sinking like ice through my veins. "So what? You're keeping me prisoner for my own safety?" The corner of his mouth twitched. "Prisoner is such a dramatic word." "It's the right word," I shot back, my voice shaking with something that wasn't quite fear anymore, something closer to fury, to disbelief at how calmly he spoke about things that could destroy a life. He tilted his head slightly, studying me as though testing the limits of my defiance. "You're not my prisoner," he said, almost as if he was trying to convince himself. "You're under my protection. There's a difference." I wanted to argue, to tell him that protection shouldn't feel like chains, but the words tangled somewhere between my throat and my heartbeat. Because beneath all the danger, all the cold logic, there was something else in his tone, something that sounded like guilt, like he hated this as much as I did. A knock broke the moment, sharp and precise. The man from earlier, Luca, I'd later learn, stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Boss, the shipment's here. We've got company waiting downstairs." Dante's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The softness vanished, replaced by that quiet authority that made everyone around him fall silent. "I'll be right there," he said, then turned to me. "Don't leave this floor, understand?" I nodded, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to do the opposite. He gave me one last look, something like a warning, or maybe a promise, then left, his presence lingering even after the door clicked shut behind him. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the empty space where he'd been. The room felt colder without him, though I hated myself for noticing it. My mind raced. There had to be a way out, some path back to normalcy. But even as I thought it, I knew the truth. Normal had ended the moment I stepped into his orbit. I wandered through the penthouse, past the silent guards who watched me like hawks, past the locked doors that whispered secrets I wasn't meant to know. And when I finally found a window overlooking the courtyard below, I saw them. Men in black unloading crates, speaking in hushed Italian, exchanging looks that told stories of blood and loyalty. That's when I understood. I wasn't just inside Dante's world, I was inside his empire. And though I wanted to believe I could still leave, a deeper part of me knew that this place, the danger, the darkness, the man himself, had already begun to pull me in. Because as the sun sank behind the city skyline and the shadows lengthened across the marble floor, I felt it, the quiet truth pressing against my ribs, impossible to deny. The wolves had accepted me. I just wasn't sure if they meant to protect me or devour me. I had always imagined fear as something sharp, something immediate and loud, like the shriek of metal or the crack of thunder. But living in Dante Valenti's world taught me that fear could also be quiet, patient, almost seductive, curling itself around your lungs until breathing started to feel like a luxury rather than a right. Days blurred into one another inside his glass and marble kingdom, where time obeyed no logic, and every hour carried the echo of his voice, the scent of his cologne, and the sound of footsteps that always seemed to find me even when I was trying to disappear. He didn't lock me in, not exactly, but freedom was a mirage that shimmered just out of reach, a trick of light on the edge of reason. The doors weren't barred, yet I knew somehow that the moment I tried to leave, the world outside would swallow me whole, and if it didn't, he would. So I stayed. Not because I trusted him, but because I no longer trusted myself. Every morning I'd wake to find a small reminder of his control, a new dress laid across the bed, delicate and expensive, always in shades of black, crimson, or ivory, as though he was painting me into his palette of power and desire. Sometimes there'd be a note, written in that same elegant hand that looked like it had been taught to command empires. Wear this, or dinner at 9. Or once, the simplest, most dangerous one of all. I want to see you. I told myself I wouldn't obey. I told myself that every time, but I always did. That night, the one that changed everything, I wore the red dress. It clung to me like sin, the fabric soft and traitorous against my skin, and when I caught my reflection in the mirror, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked like she belonged to him, like she'd been sculpted from his hunger. My heartbeat felt too loud, too alive, as if my body already knew what my mind refused to admit. That whatever this was between us, it had already crossed the line between captivity and something darker, something unholy. When I stepped into the dining room, he was waiting. Dante never rushed, never filled silence with unnecessary words. He just sat there, perfectly still, a glass of wine between his fingers, his eyes moving over me with the kind of focus that felt like worship and judgment all at once. "You look beautiful," he said, his tone low, unhurried, as though he was describing something he already owned. "I didn't dress for you," I lied, though the heat rising in my face betrayed me. A faint smile touched his mouth, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. You think you did it for yourself, then? I didn't answer, because I didn't know the answer, and maybe he knew that too, because he leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving mine, and said, "Sit." Dinner passed in a haze of quiet conversation, but every word felt like a game of strategy. Every glance a test I didn't understand the rules to. He asked about my life, not with idle curiosity, but with an intensity that stripped away pretenses. He asked about my family, my dreams, my fears, and when I hesitated, his silence coaxed the truth from me better than any threat could have. And when he spoke, when he told me pieces of his own story, about the father who'd built an empire from blood, about the weight of legacy pressed into his spine since childhood, about how power, once tasted, could never be forgotten. His voice softened in ways that shouldn't have been possible for a man like him. For a fleeting moment, I saw not the Mafia heir the world feared, but the boy who'd been forced to become something else to survive. And that frightened me more than anything, because it made me want to understand him, to comfort him. When I should have been finding a way to run, when I reached for the wine, his fingers brushed mine. It was an accident, or maybe it wasn't. Either way, it felt like an electric confession, and suddenly the air between us grew heavy with something unspeakable. He watched me take a sip, his eyes following the curve of my throat, and I couldn't stop myself from wondering what it would feel like if he leaned forward, if he touched me again. Not with command this time, but with desire. "You shouldn't look at me like that," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Like what?" "Like you're not afraid of me." I met his gaze, my pulse thrumming loud in my ears. Maybe I'm not. That was a mistake. Or maybe it was the truth I'd been hiding all along, because something shifted in his expression. A crack in the armor, a flicker of heat that was far too human. He stood, slow and deliberate, and I could feel his power fill the room like smoke as he came closer. He stopped in front of me, his hand lifting, his fingertips brushing the side of my face in a touch that was both gentle and possessive. "You have no idea what you're saying," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. "You think this is a game, but I'm not the kind of man who plays." "Then what are you?" I asked, though my voice betrayed me, trembling with a mix of fear and something darker, something reckless. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "A warning." His thumb traced my jaw, slow, deliberate, leaving fire in its wake. "You make me forget the rules," he whispered, his words so close they brushed my lips. "And that's dangerous, for both of us." I should have pulled away. I should have said no. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because in that moment, every rational thought drowned beneath the weight of him. The scent of whiskey on his breath, the warmth of his hand, the magnetic gravity that held me in place. When his lips finally touched mine, it wasn't gentle. It was possession. It was a claim spoken in a language older than words. I tasted him, felt the hunger that pulsed beneath his composure, the hunger he'd tried to hide since the night we met. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I melted. Not because I wanted to, but because some part of me already belonged to him, whether I wanted to admit it or not. The kiss broke only when he tore himself away, his breathing unsteady, his jaw clenched like he was fighting something violent inside himself. "You should go," he said, his voice rough, almost hoarse. "Why?" I whispered, even though I already knew. "Because if you stay," he said, looking at me with a darkness that made my pulse stutter, "I won't stop." And the terrifying part, the part that made my stomach twist and my heart ache, was that I didn't want him to. I stood there long after he left the room, my lips still tingling, my mind spinning in 1,000 directions. I knew what I was doing was wrong, that this wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something about him. Something broken. Dangerous. and desperate, had wrapped itself around me like a storm I couldn't escape. As the night deepened and the city lights reflected against the glass walls, I realized that I wasn't just trapped in his world anymore. I was becoming part of it. The fear that had once defined me was shifting into something else, something that looked far too much like longing. And when I closed my eyes, I could still hear his voice, low and rough and filled with warning. You make me forget the rules. But I already knew the truth. The rules were never going to save me. And the next time he touched me, neither of us would pretend to stop. There are moments in life when time doesn't just move. It fractures, splinters into jagged pieces that cut through everything you thought you knew about yourself, about the world, about the people you've allowed too close. And as I stood in Dante's penthouse days after that kiss that had stolen the air from my lungs and replaced it with something far more dangerous, I felt the edges of that fracture beginning to form, though I couldn't yet see how deep it would go. The morning light filtered through the tall glass windows, turning the city below into a haze of gold and smoke. But the beauty of it didn't reach me. Not when my thoughts were tangled in him. In the way he had touched me as if he owned the right to. And in the way I had let him. As if somewhere deep inside I had always been waiting for him to. I told myself that what happened between us had been a mistake. That it wouldn't happen again. That I could still hold on to what remained of my sanity. But lies are easiest to tell when you whisper them to yourself in the quiet, when there's no one there to challenge them. He had been avoiding me since that night. No visits to my room, no quiet meals filled with tension and unspoken words, only brief glimpses of him across the vast rooms of his empire, always surrounded by men whose eyes followed him with loyalty and fear. Men who fell silent the moment he entered. Men who seemed to know that one wrong breath could cost them everything. But the silence didn't last long. It never does in a world built on secrets. It began with a voice, low and strained, drifting through the hall one night when I thought the penthouse was empty. I had gone wandering again, restless and sleepless, drawn by the sound of anger barely contained. The door to his office was ajar, light spilling through the crack, and I don't know what possessed me to move closer, to listen when I should have turned away. But I did. Luca's voice came first, sharp and frustrated. You should have told her the truth, Dante. Sooner or later, someone else will. Not yet, Dante replied, his tone low, steady. But beneath that calm was something volatile, something breaking. She doesn't need to know. She deserves to know. You're walking a line you can't come back from. There was a long pause, the kind that stretches too far and snaps something in the air. Then Dante said, quieter this time, almost bitterly. If she finds out who she really is, if she learns what my father did, she'll never look at me the same way. The words slammed into me before I could make sense of them, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I leaned closer, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Luca sighed, the sound heavy. You can't protect her from her past forever. You think keeping her here will change what happened? Her father died because of your family, Dante. Because of you. Silence again. Thicker this time. Broken only by Dante's quiet exhale. I didn't give the order, he said, his voice low, rough with something like guilt. But I didn't stop it either. The world tilted. I don't remember leaving the doorway. Don't remember how I ended up back in my room. Only that by the time I closed the door behind me, my body was shaking, my throat tight with something between disbelief and betrayal. My father, who had died when I was 16, whose death had been labeled an accident, a story of wrong place, wrong time. I had built my life on the ashes of that lie, and now I knew it had been blood, not fate, that had taken him from me. Dante Valenti, my captor, my protector, my obsession, had been tied to that death all along. I sank onto the bed, clutching the edge of the sheets, the memories flooding back like ghosts I'd tried too long to bury. My mother's silence after the funeral, the envelope of cash that appeared at our door and was never explained, the way she'd looked at me with eyes that were both terrified and resigned. It had all been connected to him. To them. I didn't sleep that night. I waited for him. Waited for the sound of his footsteps. Waited for an explanation that I didn't want to hear, but couldn't stop needing. When dawn came, pale and merciless, I went to him instead. He was alone in the study, seated by the window, the early light cutting across his face and turning his eyes into molten gold. For a moment, I saw not the monster I wanted to hate, but the man who had once kissed me like I was the only thing tethering him to the world. But that illusion burned away as soon as he looked up and saw me standing there, because he knew. He knew I knew. "You should have told me," I said, my voice shaking despite every effort to keep it steady. "You should have told me what you did." He didn't move, didn't try to lie. His silence was answer enough. "My father," I started, but the words caught in my throat, too raw to finish. Dante stood then, his movements slow, deliberate, the mask of control slipping for just a moment. "Ava, it wasn't supposed to happen that way," he said, and I hated the way he said my name. So soft, so broken. I didn't order it. "My father, your father?" I laughed, the sound brittle and hollow. "Your father murdered mine, and you expect me to care about your excuses?" He took a step closer, but I backed away, my hands trembling. "Don't," I warned. "Don't come near me." "I tried to protect you," he said, and the desperation in his tone made my chest ache even as anger burned hotter. "You were never supposed to find out, not like this." "Protect me." The words tore from me like something sharp. "You kidnapped me, lied to me, made me believe I could trust you, and all this time you were the reason I lost everything." He reached for me then, his hand catching my wrist, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that wasn't power or pride. It was regret, deep and endless. "If I could take it back, I would," he said quietly. "But this is the world I was born into. You don't walk away from it. You survive it." I yanked my hand free, every nerve screaming at me to leave, to run, to put as much distance between us as possible. But something held me there. Something cruel and unexplainable. Because even now, even after everything, I wanted to understand him. I wanted to believe that there was still something human buried beneath all that darkness. "You can't fix this," I whispered. "You can't fix me." "I'm not trying to fix you," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. "I'm trying to keep you alive." The words made no sense, and before I could ask what he meant, the sound of shattering glass filled the air. We both turned toward the window just as a bullet embedded itself in the wall, inches from where I stood. Another followed, then another, the world erupting into chaos as Dante grabbed me, pulling me to the ground, his body shielding mine. "Get down," he ordered, his voice a low growl. The softness gone, replaced by the man I had seen at the club, the one who commanded fear like a weapon. The guards burst in, shouting orders, returning fire, and in that blur of violence I realized the truth he'd been trying to tell me. I wasn't just a liability anymore. I was a target. And as he held me there, his breath ragged against my hair, I understood something terrifying. The war that had started years ago with my father's death wasn't over. It had just found me again. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was part of it. I don't remember the sound of the final gunshot, only the silence that came after. Thick and trembling. A silence that tasted like smoke and blood and disbelief. The kind that presses against your chest until you realize that you're still breathing, and that you shouldn't be. When Dante pulled me up from the floor, his arm around me like a steel band, I saw for the first time what fear looked like on his face. Not the kind that belongs to a man afraid of dying, but the kind that belongs to someone terrified of losing something they didn't know they wanted to keep. The penthouse was chaos. Men shouting orders, in Italian, boots pounding across marble, the sharp scent of gunpowder hanging in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. A window was shattered, glass glittering across the floor like scattered diamonds, and outside I could see the city stretching endlessly below us, indifferent to the war being fought in this glass cage above it. Dante's men moved with precision, checking angles, clearing rooms, their weapons gleaming beneath the morning light. And through it all, he never let go of me. "Who was it?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, but he didn't answer, didn't even look at me, just barked orders at Luca, his tone low but lethal. "Get her downstairs," he said finally, his hand tightening on my arm when I tried to pull away. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening," I snapped, anger cutting through the fog of fear. He turned to me then, and his eyes, those cold, molten eyes, met mine with a force that left no room for argument. "Someone tried to kill you, Ava. That's what's happening." The words hit harder than the bullets that had shattered the glass, because somewhere deep down, I had believed that whatever violence existed in his world would always circle around me, never touch me directly. But now the illusion had been stripped bare. I wasn't just a bystander in his war anymore. I was a piece on the board, and someone had just tried to take me off it. Luca appeared beside us, his expression grim. "It was Marisi's men, the ones you warned last week." Dante swore under his breath, something sharp and ugly, then looked at me again, softer this time, but still every inch the man who commanded death without hesitation. "They wanted to send a message," he said, almost to himself, "and they used you to do it." "Me?" I asked, shaking my head, disbelief clawing at my throat. "Why would they?" "Because of your father," he said, the words dropping like stones into still water. "Because of me. Because they know what you mean now." I didn't ask what that meant. Not yet. Because the look in his eyes told me I wasn't ready for the answer. He guided me toward the elevator, his hand firm at the small of my back, his voice low and steady as if he was speaking to someone who might shatter if he wasn't careful. The ride down was silent except for the faint hum of the machinery and the pounding of my heart. When the doors opened, I found myself in a world I hadn't seen before. An underground level, windowless and sterile, lit by soft amber lights that made the shadows seem alive. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress. "This is where you'll stay for now," he said, leading me into a room that was both beautiful and suffocating, filled with soft light and quiet menace. "You'll be safe here." "Safe," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "You think I feel safe? You lied to me, Dante. You kept me prisoner, and now people are trying to kill me because of you." He turned away, his jaw tightening, the muscles in his neck taut with something like restraint. "I told you this world was dangerous." "No," I said, my voice rising. "You told me I was under your protection, and now I'm a target in your war. Tell me, does everyone you protect end up with bullets in their walls?" He faced me then, and the fury that burned in his eyes wasn't directed at me. It was turned inward, like a storm he'd spent his life trying to contain. "Do you think I wanted this?" he said, his tone breaking through the calm he always carried. "Do you think I wanted you caught in this? You think I haven't already lost enough?" Something in his voice cracked, and for the first time I saw the truth that lay beneath the armor. This wasn't just a man hardened by power. This was someone carrying the weight of 1,000 ghosts. Someone who'd been taught that love was just another weakness to be used against you. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing, his shoulders tense, his eyes distant. "My father built this empire on fear and blood. Every deal, every betrayal, every death, it was all part of the legacy he left behind. I've spent my entire life trying to keep it from collapsing. But every time I try to clean the blood from my hands, more spills. I wanted to hate him. I truly did. But the rawness in his voice made something inside me shift. Something I didn't want to name. "And me?" I asked quietly. "What am I in all this, Dante? A debt? A distraction?" He stopped pacing then, his gaze locking on mine, sharp and unguarded. "You're the first thing I haven't been able to control," he said, his tone low and heavy with confession. "And that terrifies me more than any enemy ever could." The air between us thickened, filled with too many words left unsaid. I wanted to scream, to tell him that I didn't want to be part of his darkness, but my body betrayed me the way it always did around him, drawn to the danger, to the heat that seemed to pulse from his skin. He took a step closer, then another, until the distance between us disappeared, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his heart beneath my palm when I pushed lightly against his chest. "You shouldn't touch me like that," I whispered, but even as I said it, I didn't pull away. "And yet you don't stop me," he murmured, his hand rising to cup the back of my neck, his thumb brushing against my pulse. "Tell me to leave, Ava. Tell me to let you go." I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come, because despite everything, the lies, the danger, the blood, I didn't want him to. I hated myself for it, but I wanted him closer, wanted to drown in the chaos that surrounded him, because for all the terror he carried, he made me feel something real, something alive, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt that way. He kissed me then, hard and desperate, a collision of guilt and longing that tasted like surrender. It wasn't the same as before. It was rougher, almost painful, the kind of kiss that demanded something neither of us could give without losing ourselves entirely. When he pulled away, his breath was uneven, his forehead resting against mine. "I can't keep you safe," he whispered. "Not from this. Not from me." "Then why try?" I asked, though my voice was barely a breath. "Because I'd rather burn the whole world down than lose you to it." The words should have terrified me, and maybe they did, but they also lit something dangerous in my chest, something that felt too much like belief. Later, when he left the room to deal with the aftermath, I stood by the door listening to the faint echoes of his voice through the corridor, calm and commanding again, already rebuilding his control. But I knew better now. I had seen the cracks, and as I stared at the reflection of my own face in the mirror, eyes wide, lips swollen from his kiss, heart tangled in a war that wasn't mine, I realized that something inside me was changing, shifting toward the darkness that surrounded him. Maybe it was love, or maybe it was madness, but I knew one thing for certain. The line between the two had already disappeared, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find it again. The night began with rain, the kind that falls softly at first, like a warning whispered against the window before it gathers strength and turns the sky into a living thing, restless and wild. And as I stood there in that dimly lit room buried beneath the city, watching the water blur the world beyond the glass, I realized that something inside me had started to unravel. It wasn't fear anymore. Fear had burned away long ago, somewhere between the first time he whispered my name like a sin and the moment I saw him covered in blood, yet still reaching for me, as if I were the only thing left worth holding on to. It was something else now, something quieter, but far more dangerous, a kind of surrender that no one had asked for, but that had already taken root deep inside me. For days, Dante had been distant, consumed by the fallout of the attack, buried in meetings and phone calls and the endless machinery of power that ran on secrecy and violence. I would hear his voice echoing down the corridors, low and controlled, issuing orders that decided who lived and who disappeared. And every time I heard it, I would feel that same pull inside me, that impossible mix of revulsion and desire that had begun to define my every breath. He was both my captor and my protector, my sin and my salvation, And the cruelest part of it all was that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. But tonight, something was different. The guards were quieter, the air thicker, the storm outside almost too perfectly timed. I had learned to recognize the rhythm of his world, the hum before chaos, the silence before blood. And I felt it now. That gathering stillness that always meant something was coming. When the door finally opened and Dante stepped inside, I knew before he even spoke that something had gone wrong. He looked tired, not in the way ordinary men looked tired, but in the way kings do when the crown starts to feel like a curse. His suit was still immaculate, but there was a shadow behind his eyes, one that hadn't been there before. "Pack your things," he said quietly, his voice calm, but carrying that undercurrent of command that always sent my pulse into chaos. "Why?" I asked, even though the answer was already forming in the back of my mind like a bruise. "Because I can't protect you here anymore," he said, walking past me toward the window, his reflection fractured by the glass and the rain. "They know where you are now. Maurice's men won't stop. They'll keep coming until they get what they want." "And what do they want?" I asked, though part of me already knew. He turned, his gaze locking on mine with that unrelenting intensity that always made the air feel thinner. "You," he said simply. "They want you. Because of me. Because they think taking you will break me." I laughed then, bitter and hollow, because there was something so absurd about it all, about how a life so ordinary, so invisible, could suddenly mean this much in a world I never asked to be part of. "Then let me go," I said, the words sharp, desperate. "If being near me puts me in danger, if being near me puts you in danger, then just let me go." He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand catching my wrist before I could take another step. "You think I could do that?" he said, his voice low, almost trembling. "You think I could just watch you walk away knowing what's waiting for you out there?" His grip was firm but not cruel, and when I met his eyes, I saw it again. That war he carried inside him. The one between the man who ruled through fear and the one who wanted, so desperately, to feel something real. "I'm not safe with you," I said, my voice breaking despite my best effort to stay steady. "You said it yourself." "You're safer with me than without me," he said, and though it should have sounded like reassurance, it felt more like a confession, one that neither of us knew how to live with. I pulled my hand free, stepping back, the distance between us feeling like a wound. "This isn't living, Dante. This is surviving. You don't get to decide my life just because you're afraid to lose me." He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the table, poured a glass of whiskey, and stood there staring at it, as if the answers were hiding somewhere in its depths. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythm of the rain. Then finally he spoke. "There's a deal," he said slowly, as though each word cost him something. "A way to end this war before it consumes everything my family built." He looked up at me then, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "But the price they're asking is you." I felt the words like a physical blow, my knees threatening to give out. "You mean they want you to give me to them?" I said, my voice shaking. He nodded once, the motion small, restrained, as if even admitting it might break him. "If I do, they'll call a truce. The bloodshed stops. My men live. My empire survives." The room spun. I couldn't tell if it was from rage or heartbreak or both. "And what about me?" I asked. "What happens to me once you hand me over?" His eyes softened, and for the first time I saw something like pain flicker there. "You won't survive it," he said quietly. "Then why are you even considering it?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. "Because power always demanded sacrifice. Because in his world, love was a liability." He set the glass down, the sound sharp against the silence, and in 2 steps he was in front of me again, his hand rising to cut my face, his thumb tracing the corner of my mouth with unbearable tenderness. "Because if I don't," he said, his voice breaking on the edges, "they'll kill everyone I've ever protected. They'll burn everything I've spent my life building. And you'll still be in danger because they'll never stop coming." I wanted to hate him then, wanted to scream that I didn't care about his empire or his bloodlines or the ghosts of men who had died for his name. But the truth was that I did care. Not about the power, but about him. About the man beneath it all. The one who had bled for me, lied for me, kissed me like he was drowning. So I made a choice. One I didn't fully understand, but that felt inevitable all the same. "I'll go," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm outside. His expression shattered, just for a second, but then the mask returned. "No," he said immediately, his tone final. "You said it yourself," I pressed. "If it ends the war, if it keeps others safe." "I won't let them touch you," he interrupted, his voice rising with a kind of raw fury I'd never heard from him before. "I won't trade you for peace I don't believe in." "Then what's left, Dante?" I asked, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. "What happens when the world you're fighting to protect starts taking everything you love?" He didn't answer. He just looked at me, his chest rising and falling too fast, his jaw tight, his control unraveling in front of me. Then suddenly he pulled me against him, his mouth finding mine in a kiss that felt like the edge of a cliff, desperate and consuming, filled with everything we couldn't say out loud. His hands gripped my waist, holding me as if he could keep me from slipping away, and when he finally tore his lips from mine, his breath was ragged. "I can't let you go," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "You don't understand, Ava. You're the only thing keeping me from becoming the monster they think I am." And maybe that was the most terrifying part, that I believed him. Outside, thunder rolled through the sky, and somewhere deep in the city, sirens began to wail. The storm was coming, both outside and within these walls, and I knew, with a kind of dreadful clarity, that whatever happened next would change everything. Because this wasn't just a choice between freedom and captivity anymore. It was a choice between survival and destruction. And as I stood there in his arms, feeling the weight of his heartbeat against mine, I realized that I was already too far gone to turn back. This was the night of no return. And whether we survived it or burned in it, I already knew. I wasn't leaving without him. There is a peculiar stillness that comes just before everything begins to fall apart. A fragile and deceptive quiet that feels almost holy, as if the world itself is holding its breath before it collapses. And in the days that followed that night, the night when Dante and I stood on the precipice of something neither of us could escape, I felt that stillness wrapping around us like silk, hiding a blade. The rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy, thick with the scent of gunpowder and inevitability, and every glance, every whispered conversation that passed through the walls of the Valenti estate felt like the ticking of a clock winding down to something we both knew was coming but refused to name. Dante had become a ghost of himself, more silent, more distant, though his silence carried a violence that made the air tremble when he entered a room. I would watch him sometimes from the window as he paced the courtyard below, speaking to men I didn't recognize, his gestures sharp and deliberate, the kind of movements that belonged to a man who had stopped hoping for peace and had started preparing for war. The empire he ruled, built on blood and fear and the brittle bones of loyalty, was beginning to splinter, cracks spreading through the foundations like veins beneath marble, and even his most trusted allies were starting to whisper in the shadows. I heard them once, two of his men arguing outside the hall late at night, their voices low but trembling with unease. "He's losing control," one of them said. "The families are turning. They think he's weak." The other replied, "He's not weak. He's distracted. Ever since her." Her. The word burned when I heard it, because even in this world of men who killed without hesitation, I had somehow become the soft spot in the armor of a man who could bend nations. I had become the thing they blamed him for. And though I told myself I didn't care, that I wasn't part of their story, deep down I knew I was, because he had made me part of it. It was late when he came to me again. The sky outside was bruised purple, the city beneath us glowing faintly, its heartbeat faint against the glass. I had been sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting, though I told myself I wasn't. He didn't knock, he never did, just walked in like a storm, his shirt half undone, the tension radiating off him like heat. His eyes found mine immediately, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because words had become useless things between us, fragile, temporary, incapable of holding the weight of what we were. "They betrayed me," he said finally, his voice quiet but filled with something that wasn't anger so much as resignation. "Men I've fed, protected, trusted since I was a boy. They've made deals with Marisi behind my back." My breath caught. "What does that mean?" "It means the Valenti name doesn't scare them anymore," he said, pacing, his hand raking through his hair. "It means they think they can take everything from me, and maybe they're right. Maybe I let it happen." "You didn't," I said softly, though I wasn't sure why I believed it. He looked at me then, the corners of his mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You still think I'm worth defending?" "I think you're human," I said, and his eyes darkened because in his world that word was both an insult and a salvation. He moved toward me, each step slow, deliberate, until he was standing close enough that I could feel the heat of his body through the air between us. "You shouldn't," he murmured. "You shouldn't see me that way. You shouldn't see me at all." "I can't help it," I whispered. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against my jaw, tracing the line of my face with a kind of reverence that didn't belong in this world of guns and vendettas. "You don't understand what's coming," he said, his voice breaking against the words. "When this war ends, there won't be anything left standing. Not me, not them, not us." The way he said us made my chest ache, because I knew he didn't mean it as a promise. He meant it as an apology. The next days blurred together, the lines between dawn and dusk disappearing in a haze of tension and sleeplessness. The estate filled with men who spoke in hushed tones, who came and went in black cars that never lingered long enough to be remembered. I tried to stay invisible, but invisibility was no longer something I could wear. They all looked at me differently now, with suspicion, with resentment, with the quiet acknowledgement that I was the reason their world was shifting beneath them. Luca was the only one who dared speak to me directly. He found me one afternoon in the library, my hands tracing the spines of books that hadn't been touched in years. "You should talk to him," he said, his voice softer than usual. "He listens to you even when he pretends he doesn't." "What would I say?" I asked, turning to face him. "Tell him that this isn't who he is," Luca said, his expression unreadable. "Before you, he was already gone. You brought him back, at least for a little while." The words unsettled me, not because of what they meant, but because part of me wanted to believe them. That night I found Dante in his office again, the city lights reflecting off the glass behind him like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Papers were scattered across the desk, maps, photographs, ledgers, evidence of a life built on control now slipping through his fingers. He didn't look up when I entered, but he didn't tell me to leave either. "You can still stop this," I said quietly, stepping closer. "You don't have to fight them. You could walk away." He laughed, low and humorless. "Walk away to what, Ava? You think men like me get to start over? You think I can just disappear?" "You could try." He shook his head. "If I fall, others rise in my place. Worse men. Men who don't hesitate to kill for pleasure instead of necessity. If I don't fight, this world burns anyway. At least this way I can decide who survives the fire. I didn't know what to say to that, because it wasn't the kind of logic that belonged to normal people. It was the logic of a man who had never been given a choice, who had been born with blood on his hands and told to make an empire out of it. So instead of speaking, I reached out and touched his face, my fingers trembling as they brushed the stubble along his jaw. "Then don't let them take your humanity too," I whispered. He looked up at me then, and whatever control he'd been clinging to shattered in that moment. He pulled me to him, his hands gripping my waist, his mouth finding mine with the kind of desperation that only comes when you know the world is about to end. It wasn't a kiss of passion anymore. It was survival. It was grief. It was the quiet promise of something that couldn't last but refused to die quietly. It's strange how quickly a world can collapse, how something that once seemed indestructible can fall apart in silence before the first explosion ever sounds, how power doesn't vanish with noise but with the quiet realization that the people who swore to die for you have already begun to betray you. And as I stood in Dante's office, watching the rain blur the skyline of a city that was no longer ours, I could feel the slow unraveling of everything he had built. An empire made of blood and fear and whispered loyalty. An empire that was crumbling beneath the weight of secrets too heavy to keep and love too dangerous to survive. The war that had begun with a single bullet had become something larger, something monstrous and alive, and though I had once believed it belonged only to him, I knew now that it belonged to me too, because I had let him pull me into it, let him brand me with his darkness, let him make me part of the story that was always meant to end in fire. It started with a call, Luca's voice, strained and unfamiliar, breaking through the tense quiet that had settled between us in the days since the deal was broken. "They're inside," he said, his words ragged, breathless. "Someone let them in." The glass shattered before Dante could respond. A storm of bullets tore through the upper floor, men shouting, guns roaring, the sharp metallic scent of blood cutting through the air, and before I could even think, Dante had pulled me to the ground, his body shielding mine as chaos erupted around us. The sound was deafening, but worse than that was the look in his eyes. Cold, calculating, yet touched by something raw, something like panic. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice barely audible over the thunder of gunfire. "I'm not leaving you," I said, though the words came out more like a plea than defiance. He didn't answer, just pressed a gun into my shaking hands, his fingers closing over mine. "If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you shoot," he said, his tone calm in a way that terrified me more than any shout ever could. He moved then, fluid and precise, a dark blur of violence and grace, and for a moment I understood why everyone feared him. Dante Valenti wasn't just a man. He was something forged in fire, something that couldn't die easily. I watched him disappear down the hall, heard the echo of his voice commanding his men, the sound of return fire, and then nothing. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that hums with dread, that stretches time until every heartbeat feels like the last. I waited, my breath shallow, my fingers trembling against the gun, my mind replaying every word he'd ever said about protection and danger and choices. When the door finally creaked open, I nearly pulled the trigger, but it wasn't him. It was Luca, blood on his sleeve, his face pale beneath the dim light. "We have to go," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Now." "Where's Dante?" I asked, standing too quickly, my head spinning. "He stayed behind," Luca said, his voice hard, his expression unreadable. "He told me to get you out." "No," I said immediately, shaking my head. "I'm not leaving without him." Luca's jaw tightened. "If you stay, you'll die." "Then so be it," I said, the words surprising even me. But they were true. Because the idea of running, of leaving him behind in a burning empire, was worse than death. Before Luca could argue, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, sharp and deliberate. We both froze. The door burst open, and men in black flooded the room. Everything happened too fast. Luca fired, the room filled with smoke and shouts. Hands grabbed me, rough and merciless. And then the world tilted. They dragged me down a corridor I didn't recognize. My wrists caught in iron grips, my voice breaking as I called his name, over and over. But he didn't answer. And for the first time since this began, I felt truly alone, stripped of the illusion that he would always come for me. The men threw me into a dark room, the door slamming shut behind me, the echo of it final and absolute. I hit the ground hard, my palms scraping against cold concrete, the air thick with dust and gasoline. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the faint glow of light leaking through the cracks. And when they did, I saw him, across the room, chained, his face bruised, his white shirt stained with blood. Dante, I breathed, crawling toward him before the hands caught me again, yanking me upright. Don't touch her, he roared, his voice raw, feral, a sound that didn't belong to a man, but to something wild and desperate. The man holding me laughed, the sound low and cruel. So this is the girl who brought down the great Dante Valenti, he said, his accent heavy, his grip tightening around my arm. You really did have a weakness, didn't you? Dante's eyes met mine then, and in them I saw fury and fear and love twisted together until they were indistinguishable. Ava, don't listen to him, he said, his voice breaking. Whatever happens, don't. The man struck him before he could finish, the sound of it sharp and final. I screamed, but the noise died in my throat as one of the others pressed a gun against my temple. This ends tonight, the leader said. Valenti dies, his kingdom burns, and the girl, well, maybe we let her watch. I didn't think. I moved. My hand found the knife Luca had hidden in my belt before they dragged me here, and I drove it backward into the man's side. He shouted, his grip loosening, and I tore free, stumbling toward Dante as the room erupted in chaos again. Run! He shouted, but I didn't. I couldn't. My hands worked at the chains binding his wrists, my breath coming in ragged bursts, the metallic scent of blood heavy in the air. He was weaker than I'd ever seen him, but his eyes, those eyes still burned. The door burst open again, gunfire flashing through the dark. Dante pulled me down, shielding me with his body even as he reached for the weapon lying on the floor. He fired once, twice, and then it was quiet again. The kind of quiet that only comes after too much violence. When he finally looked at me, his face was pale, his voice a whisper. You shouldn't have come for me. You shouldn't have stayed behind, I said, tears streaking my face. He laughed, a broken sound, his hand cupping my cheek with what little strength he had left. You're the only thing in this world I can't destroy, he said softly, and that's what terrifies me. I wanted to tell him it didn't matter, that none of this mattered as long as he lived. But before I could, the floor beneath us shuddered, a deep, low rumble that grew louder by the second. Smoke began to pour in through the cracks in the ceiling, and I realized with horror what they'd done. The place was wired to burn. Dante's hand tightened on mine. Go, he said. You have to go now. I'm not leaving you, I whispered, shaking my head. He tried to smile, but it broke, halfway. You don't have a choice, he said, his voice barely a breath. They lit the fuse. The sound of the explosion tore through the air a heartbeat later, a wave of heat and light swallowing everything in its path. The world tilted, the ceiling caved, and as the fire roared toward us, I saw him one last time, his eyes locked on mine, his lips forming words I couldn't hear but felt deep in my bones. Run! And then the fire took him. The world ended in fire, and for a long time after, I believed that I had ended with it. I remember the sound before anything else, the deafening roar of the explosion that tore through the night like some ancient god reclaiming what was his. The sound of the building collapsing, of glass and steel and promises breaking all at once. I remember heat swallowing me whole, the smoke curling around my lungs like a living thing, and the desperate thought that if this was how it ended, at least I had died with him. But death, I learned, isn't always merciful, and sometimes survival is the crueler fate, because I woke to the sound of rain again, somewhere far away from the fire, with lungs that burned and a heart that refused to stop beating even when it had no reason to continue. They told me later that Dante had been found in the wreckage, that his body had been pulled from the ashes hours after the explosion, that he was alive, but barely. I didn't believe them at first because Dante Valenti had always been larger than life, too powerful, too relentless, too untouchable to be reduced to something so fragile. But when I saw him, wrapped in bandages, his face pale, his breath shallow, his hands scarred from pulling me through the flames, I realized that power doesn't make a man immortal. It only makes his fall more devastating. The hospital was hidden, of course, guarded and secret, a place where his enemies couldn't reach him, and for weeks I stayed by his side, watching the machines breathe for him, listening to the rhythm of his heart through the steady pulse of the monitors, a rhythm I had once heard beneath my fingertips when he held me too close. I didn't speak much during those days. There was nothing left to say that could make sense of what had happened. His empire was gone, burned, scattered, devoured by the same greed that had built it. Luca had disappeared. The Valenti name once spoken in fear was now a ghost whispered in back alleys and abandoned warehouses. But Dante lived, and that was enough. When he finally woke, it wasn't dramatic like in the movies. It was quiet, fragile, the slow flutter of his eyelids and the faintest tightening of his fingers around mine. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a rasp. "You stayed." I laughed, though the sound was cracked and hollow. "You sound surprised." He smiled, faintly, painfully. "I told you to run. And you should know by now I never listen." He tried to chuckle, but it turned into a wince, and for a moment I thought he might slip back into the darkness that had almost claimed him. But he didn't. He was too stubborn for that. Dante Valenti had survived gunfire, betrayal, and the ruin of his own empire. Death, it seemed, had met its match. In the days that followed, we existed in a kind of suspended reality, a quiet exile where the world outside didn't matter, and the rules of his past no longer applied. The doctors came and went, whispering in Italian, offering pity in their eyes when they thought I wasn't looking. He healed slowly, his body scarred, his strength returning like an echo of who he used to be. But something in him had changed. The sharpness that had once defined him had dulled. Not his intelligence, not his control, but that edge of ruthlessness that had made him feared. He would sit by the window for hours, staring at the rain as it fell against the glass, and sometimes, when he thought I was asleep, he would whisper things, apologies, prayers, maybe both. One night, when the storm was loud enough to drown the sound of our breathing, he said something that stayed with me long after. "I don't know who I am without it," he murmured, not looking at me. "The power, the fear, the blood, it's all I've ever been." I reached out, tracing the line of his jaw where the scars had begun to fade. "You're still you," I said softly. "Just not the version the world made you become." He turned then, his eyes catching the faint light, and for the first time I saw not the Mafia heir or the man who had owned the city's shadows, but someone stripped bare, human, fallible, searching. "And what am I now?" he asked quietly. I smiled, though my heart ached with everything that had been lost. "Mine," I said. For a long moment neither of us spoke, and in that silence there was peace, fragile and uncertain but real. the kind of peace that doesn't come from winning wars but from surviving them. Eventually, the day came when he could stand again, walk again, look at the world without flinching. We left the hospital before dawn, the air cool and damp, the sky painted in soft shades of gray. The city was different now, smaller somehow, stripped of its glamour and menace. The streets that had once bowed to his name no longer remembered it, and maybe that was a mercy. We drove for hours, no destination, no plan, just distance. The further we went, the lighter it felt, as if every mile peeled away another layer of the past. We ended up by the sea, a small coastal town that didn't know us, didn't care who we had been. The locals called him Mr. D. They thought I was his wife. We didn't correct them. Days turned into weeks, and slowly life began to rebuild itself in quiet, unremarkable ways. I found work at a small cafe near the harbor. Dante spent his days fixing things, boats, engines, broken furniture, as if repairing the world around him might somehow make up for all the things he'd destroyed. Sometimes at night, we'd sit by the water, and he would tell me stories, not of power or violence, but of the things he'd once wanted to be before the world demanded he become something else. And every time he looked at me, I could see that the fire which had once burned everything in its path had turned into something softer, steadier, a warmth that didn't consume but endured. But the past never truly dies. It lingers, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to remind you of what you've done, of what you've lost. One evening, a letter arrived. No return address, no signature, just a single line written in Dante's father's handwriting. You can't bury a name built on blood. He didn't say anything when he read it, just folded it carefully and slipped it into the fire. The flames devoured it slowly, the edges curling to ash. When he turned to me, his expression was calm, resigned. But his eyes held something that wasn't there before. A decision. We'll always be running, he said quietly. Then we'll run together, I replied. He smiled then, that rare, quiet smile that still managed to break me open. You make it sound easy. It's not supposed to be easy, I said, reaching for his hand. It's just supposed to be real. That night, as we lay together listening to the waves crash against the shore, I thought about everything that had led us here. The chaos, the lies, the pain, the fire. And I realized that maybe this was what redemption looked like. Not absolution, but the act of choosing to keep living, even when the past keeps trying to claim you. He slept before I did. His arm draped over me, his breathing steady. I watched the moonlight trace the lines of his face, and I thought of all the names he'd carried: boss, sinner, savior, monster, and how none of them mattered anymore. In the end, he was just Dante. And I was just the girl who'd once been lost in a crowd until the Mafia boss whispered, "You're mine tonight," and changed the course of both our lives forever. I don't know what the future holds, and maybe that's the point. Maybe love isn't about safety or certainty, but about the courage to stand beside someone even as the world burns around you. Because sometimes, what saves you isn't light. It's the one who walks with you through the dark and refuses to let go. And if I had to do it all again, every lie, every scar, every night spent in the shadow of his danger, I would. Because in the fire I found him, and in him I found myself,